Great, so now we've addressed, I'd say, my main issues with this image. So let's just render these out again. The base, the ambient occlusion, and the z-depth. And let's jump back into Photoshop. So again, save all of your layers out like you did previously by selecting them one by one and just saving them here. This icon will be available once your render is done to 100%. And we'll see what else we can come up with in terms of things to fix, in terms of things to improve, and really just making a concept for our concept later on, I guess. Okay, now we're back into Photoshop. I've brought in all of my new renders. I can compare them with my old. If I do this, we can see that we've achieved some of our goals. Okay, let's have a look at how we can sort of find the story cues and how to find the interest in this image at this point. So one thing that I really like to do, and let me just fill the background first. Cool. One thing that I quite like to do is to play around with the haze to start off with. So let's copy this depth pass, and in it, let's copy it twice. So I'll keep an extra copy, save, and disable it. In this copy, if I go to my blending options, and here I have my blend if settings, which we'll be using a lot later, but just to show you now, I can, for example, use the slider to make the shadows from this layer be cut out, right? Or I can do the same with highlights. And this works really well with depth because, of course, we have dark colors in the foreground and bright colors in the background. So when I'm keying out the shadows, it is literally all of the foreground that leaves the image. I can, of course, do the same, but by using the underlying layer instead of the current layer. So this uses everything underneath this layer. So if I do this, I get all of the shadows from beneath showing through, but I don't want this right now. So what I want to do right now is to use this z-depth just to see where I could add more haze later when I'm doing the final painting, where I can use the haze to cut out different elements. So for example, let's cut it out here. So I have the haze behind these two buildings, but they are free of it. So we'll do this. Actually, let's bring it around here. And you have this little arrow here. If you hold down Alt on your keyboard and take one of these little halves of the arrow and drag it, you can make this transition smoother. See, previously it was sharp, but this way you can make it smooth. So that's very cool. So let's do that. And set this back to screen. And let's add a layer mask and click Ctrl-I to invert it. And select our brush tool with white color enabled. And let's just paint in some haze here. And a little bit here maybe. And this now allows us to selectively add haze wherever we want. This is a technique that is great for creating concept art if you have a 3D render and you have a depth pass to go with it. It is much better to paint the haze using the depth pass than to just randomly paint it with your brush tool. So I do a lot of this. Now this has made this area a lot more interesting. Previously, this was getting a little bit lost. It was hard to tell what was in the foreground, what was in the background, but when I do this, this cuts out this shape perfectly, right? So this doesn't have to be as obvious. I can lower the opacity a little bit, and maybe that's even better. So let's do this a few times, right? Here, maybe we can try to cut out some shapes along here. I feel like that's quite cool. And again, this is just for my own idea generation. This is not for the final image, and you can skip this step if you know exactly what you want to create, but I find this quite helpful because I come up with a lot of ideas and I see a lot of problems that I wouldn't have otherwise when I do this. For example, adding the haze here has made me aware of the fact that this is a little bit of a strange looking area in terms of geometry, so maybe I'll want to fix that later. You know, it's a good idea to kind of spot these problems early on. So maybe let's do it once more, or maybe once or twice. Oops. Copy this. It's always good to keep a spare copy of your depth because you never know when you'll need an extra little bit of haze. Okay, I think here we can get like a little bit of a cool shape on this building. Let's just change it to maybe that much. Okay. And click to invert this. Oops, got the wrong tool selected. And paint in a little bit here. We can separate there a little bit. Maybe even here. I think here maybe. Very cool. So now if I group these together by selecting them all and clicking Ctrl G, you can see I've not made any big changes, but instantly clarified the image in some places in order to, for example here, bring out the shape. Previously this was nothing. This was just a bit of gray in a field of gray. You couldn't identify what this was, but now, oh wow, that's a shape. That's very cool, right? And I'm really just trying to find the story cues at the minute. Really kind of try to define the idea. When the viewer looks at this, what do they think? Can they feel like they're in the city? Do they look at, say, this area and go, wow, that's cool, I'm seeing some interesting stuff? Or, like previously, they think, oh, you know, that's some meaningless detail, I don't care, right? Another cool way you can play around with haze at this stage is to maybe, say, create a black layer and just click filter, render clouds, and then filter, render difference clouds. Maybe do that a couple of times. Let's click screen, and now click Ctrl T to transform, and let's just drag these edges to conform them to our perspective. So following these perspective lines, right? And if I make this bigger, here I think I want to do it like a little bit like this. And again, this is just a little trick that I use while working. Cool. And now, if we select our haze layer at the top and enable it, and then select our layer that we just created here and create a mask and go to image and apply image, this will take whatever we have at the top or whatever is visible on the screen, and it will copy it to our mask. So for this, I now have this mask. So for example, I can then select my mask and oops, and go into image adjustments, curves, and just disable this like so, and enable it here. And here maybe I'll delete the edges that are a bit obvious. Here I'll again go into curves of my mask and just make sure it clips out these foreground buildings. And now I have a cool little bit of haze that I've added here. And you know, feel free to delete it wherever you want. So that's quite useful. And okay, let's start thinking of actual story and architectural elements. So for this I thought I quite like this opening, but currently it does not represent any architectural style. If you remember the images I showed at the very start of this tutorial, I had a lot of Indian Mughal architecture, which included a lot of arches, a lot of minarets, which are towers, things like that. And let's include some of that back in here. So I'll just create a layer on top, and I'll just start painting a little bit. And again, you don't have to do this, but I tend to do this just while working out my concept, because I don't know quite what I want, and it's at this stage in the image where I'm not yet committed to my idea. You know, I can change this very easily, so while I can do so, I want to make sure that the image I have and the idea I have is as good as I can make it. So for example here, I think, let's really block a lot of this out. Let me just check my brush. Okay. So here I can create a little bit of an archway. Let's just work this up a little bit more. Kind of actually define this shape a little bit better. We'll try to make it into an actual arch. Yeah, sort of like this. It doesn't have to be perfect, but this is kind of the progression of logic that I had when I was making this image. I wanted to take this whole part, which was indiscernible. This could have been anything, any era, any genre of art. This could have been science fiction, this could have been fantasy, this could have been whatever, and actually make it look a little bit more planned out. So now also it aids into really kind of keeping the attention focused here. And below it, I think here, actually, yeah, if I just drop down, say like a rule of thirds grid, really roughly, we would have something like this, right? And so I want one of my main focal points to be here, and my other main focal point to be here. So diagonal. For example, in your image, you might want to do it here and here, but I feel like that putting them diagonally across from each other works the best. You know, if I had my main focal point here and the secondary one here, I think that works not as well with the rule of thirds. In this case, maybe you might want to draw a triangle and have a third point here, but I always find that this kind of method works better. So here at this point, I wanted to add something really interesting, so I think I decided to go with a big dome structure. And this is much more interesting instantly, right? Let's add some highlight to it. Cool. And instantly, this whole part of the image has been transformed from something indiscernible to something really cool. Now let's see what kind of similar stuff we can do elsewhere. So let's bring back our fog here. Maybe I want to make that a little bit brighter. And I think it would be cool to have some interest here in this whole area. So, for example, we could have a tower here and have it catching some light from over here. So Let's just do a bit of this. And this whole edge, you know, we might want to have some nice little highlights that are catching the light. Furthermore, I think this whole building is currently a little bit problematic because there's nothing interesting going on here. I found a solution for this, but not for this just yet. So, how about, and this was my way of thinking when I was making the image, is flatten this out a little bit. Let's flatten this out a little bit. We have something like this. And let's add a more interesting element here. So previously we were looking at a lot of arches, and I think this would be a good place to utilize one as well. So let's have something here like this. Twist this a bit more. And maybe again somewhere here like this. Make this a little bit smaller. And we could then transform this whole area from being quite bland to having some sort of an entrance into this huge structure, and this instantly adds a lot of story to the image, right? Let's say if I make this into a set of stairs, and let's do maybe something similar here, like this. And again, I'm not trying to make this into a fantastic concept right now, just trying to figure out my ideas for what I'm doing here, because previously I had a lot of scattering and that was good for establishing my starting detail, but not good for actually making the image interesting to look at, you know? No one wants to look at a bunch of CG shapes. It's very easy to create an image using computers nowadays, but we still want to give it that human touch to make it really interesting to the viewer and make them wonder, what is this world that the artist has created? And this is the step where I really start establishing that. So here, you know, we can turn this into a more interesting shape, right? Here I've got a little bit of a highlight that I can use. That's quite cool, you know, something like this, and I'm doing this very roughly, just trying to kind of get a basic idea out. So, you know, that's instantly a lot more interesting than it was. This was a lot of random shapes, and maybe they look kind of cool, but not with the architectural style that I wanted. So we can keep doing this, and, you know, maybe even cut out some shape here. Maybe do this, right? That's quite interesting now. I select that and do this. Now there is some interest there as well. And yeah, we're just trying to kind of find ways to tell a story with this image and create a world that seems believable. So what else, you know? I think I made a lot of these areas here at the top that look cool, but I'm not quite sure what they are. So how about we turn them into some upside down domes? You know, there were a lot of domes in the reference imagery. None of them quite like this. None of them were upside down, but this is a fantasy city, so, you know, we can some things that aren't in the real world. As long as we use real architecture, it's quite okay. You know, not everything has to be fully realistic, but because we're using a lot of believable elements, we can get away with quite a few of these sort of decisions that are more based on fantasy. Here, for example, as well, here, if I add this, that's kind of cool, right? So I've already done quite a bit. Maybe let's tone this down here a little bit. Right, that's quite cool. What next? What else can we do? We can sort of look at, you know, adding some maybe highlights to certain parts of the image. You know, see where we could like draw a little bit more attention. Maybe add a little bit of a dome here. You know, something like that. Right? So that's quite cool. Maybe we could have more steps leading down here, and as well here. You know, I feel like we're missing a lot of opportunities to make stuff interesting there. Something that leads down there. Let's maybe get rid of a little bit of this fog here. Oops, not that much. Darken that a bit. Here, maybe let's add another dome. I feel like this is a nice little area for something slightly interesting. We don't want any main focal point, but just something that when the viewer looks at it for long enough catches their eye and seems interesting enough to look at. Yeah. And then, for example, here we could have a little dome that catches the light a little bit. So let's just add a little bit of a highlight. And you can see here, I'm just using a little bit of a brighter color to indicate that this is catching the light, but it's instantly much more interesting than it previously was, right? So we can do this for quite a while. I think maybe this area is currently a little bit confusing, so maybe let's fill this, and again here let's add a little bit of a dome or something. If I do this, just paint this in here. Right, and then maybe add some stairs here. Cool. Instantly much cooler than it was before, you know? It seems like these are real kind of buildings and real structures now. So I'm quite happy with a lot of these additions I've made, but I would like to still add some life. Remember earlier we talked about adding life to your image in the way of adding people and adding vehicles and waterfalls. So let's have a look at adding some vehicles maybe. So I've just selected my polygonal lasso tool, and I'm just gonna roughly select some shapes and fill them in with a bit of a dark color. So maybe a spaceship there, one here somewhere. And again, it can be quite rough at this stage. Don't worry about it being perfect. Starting this down. I think maybe let's have one over here. and just select a color from nearby so that your colors are accurate to the kind of haze that you have. Here on top we can add a little highlight, and then maybe darken the bottom a little bit. Yeah, maybe here we can add some spaceship. You know, nothing too obvious, but just something to catch the viewer's attention, right? So that's kind of cool. And also let's add some waterfalls, and I had quite a lot of fun with these because water is really good at catching light and reflecting light, and if we use this correctly, we can really draw the viewer's attention. And you got to think about this, you know, using all of the elements available to you to direct where the viewer looks first and second. So this is one of the main focal points of the image, and I thought it'd be quite cool to, for example, do a little bit of a waterfall here. Maybe there's something going on there, and this is catching the light maybe, and running down and, you know, sort of going around here somewhere. Again, at this stage I'm not trying to make it perfect, but just sort of trying to come up with something cool. Adding a little bit of interest to the image, right? So let's do this here. Here let's maybe add a little bit of water that goes down through all of these parts and goes down here. Maybe, you know, even goes across here. It doesn't matter. Let's use the burn tool with highlight selected just to darken this slightly where the shadows are. It doesn't need to be so bright. But that instantly makes it more interesting. Let's make a new layer and just do some quick falling water here. We'll erase it from around here. So again, here I'm trying to cut out this tower that I've made here, and again I'm trying to get rid of a little bit of the detail in the background. I don't need so much of it, so let's have some falling water here. And I think yeah, like this whole area, make the opacity smaller. You know, you can have falling water here, just have silhouettes behind it of those temples. And again, you know, we could have a little bit of interaction between, say, this spaceship and this waterfall, and the water goes down here. Maybe a little bit falling here in the very foreground, and as well as if, for example, I put this under the spaceship, we could have, you know, some here and like really highlight the spaceship. And again, remember I said earlier when we were working with lights, I'm trying to put the dark against the light, and the dark against the light, and the light against the dark, just over and over and over. So I'm really utilizing this ability to make certain parts of the image pop. And again, you got to be careful with where you do it so that it's not too much. For example, here I'm highlighting this spaceship a little bit, but this is too much, right? So I want to, you know, I don't want to draw this much attention to this corner of the image. I want most of the attention here. So let me just lower this a little bit. So, you know, this still cuts out this shape and the viewers will see it, but I don't want them to see it on the first glance, right? So, you know, you can keep doing this forever, but keep it very rough, and remember to go back into Clarice and actually make these changes, and this will be a great concept for your final image, right? So look at how much I've done, and it's not that much, but it really makes the image come alive with a story instead of just being, you know, a simple scattering exercise, right? So I think now let's go back into Clarice and let's start really trying to implement some of these ideas that I've created here.